Okay, in this video I'm going to spend some time talking about Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, where Anselm aims to show that God necessarily exists just given the nature of God's being. So I think it's useful to start with a look at philosophical arguments. An argument is a set of statements ordered in such a way so as to show the final statement is true, probable, or likely. The leading statements we call the premises, and the final statement we call the conclusion. Here's an example. Premise 1, all dogs are mortal. Premise 2, Benny is a dog. 3, the conclusion, therefore Benny is mortal. So statements 1 and 2 are the premises, and statement 3 is the conclusion. In this argument, the premises are ordered in a specific way. They're ordered to show that the conclusion follows from the two premises. An argument that has a good logical structure, like the one we're looking at, is said to be valid. So validity concerns the structure of arguments. In addition, we can ask about the truth of the premises. An argument which is valid, which is to say it has a good structure, and has true premises, is said to be sound. So this argument is sound because it is valid, it has a good structure, and the premises are true. It is the case that all dogs are mortal, and the being that I'm referring to, Benny, is in fact a dog. So it follows that Benny is mortal. Next, we should look at the distinction between deductive and inductive arguments. This is helpful for understanding the kind of argument we're evaluating. A deductive argument shows that the conclusion is definitely or necessarily true. So here I have another version of the previous argument. All human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is a deductive argument because if the premises are true, it necessarily follows that the conclusion is true. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, show that the conclusion is probable or likely, though not definitely or necessarily true. So here's an example. Premise 1, Republicans typically win in Texas. Premise 2, Trump is a Republican. In conclusion, 3, therefore Trump will win in Texas. This argument shows that it's pretty good reasoning to suggest that Trump will win in Texas, just given the fact that Republicans typically win in Texas, and Trump happens to be a Republican. But it's not definitely or necessarily the case that Trump will win in Texas, because perhaps someone else will run, or perhaps Trump won't be successful after all because of some attribute that he has. So it seems likely that Trump will win in Texas, but it's not necessarily the case. Inductive reasoning is the kind of reasoning we often use in our daily lives to make good judgments about what we ought to do. It's significantly harder to arrive at deductive arguments because they need to be logically structured so as to show that the conclusion is necessary. There are inductive arguments for the existence of God. An inductive argument for the existence of God that succeeds will just show that God's existence is probable or likely. So here's an example. This is the design argument from William Paley. Premise 1 says, the universe is structured like a machine. When we look out at the universe, we see that it has a specific kind of structure. It seems like it's moving in specific and intentional ways. Premise 2 says, machines are made by designers. That's just who makes machines, designers or engineers. Premise 3, therefore the universe is made by a designer. Since the universe is machine-like, and since machine-like things are made by designers, it would follow that the universe is made by a designer. Premise 4, only something which is all-powerful could design the universe. Just given the scope of the universe, the thing which designed it would have to be immense and skilled and knowledgeable. Premise 5, God is all-powerful. In conclusion, 6, therefore God designed the universe. This is an inductive argument because it doesn't show that God necessarily designed the universe. So it doesn't necessarily show that God exists. It might even be that something which is all-powerful designed the universe, and it might additionally be that God is all-powerful, but it could be the case that something other than God, some other all-powerful thing, designed the universe. This just shows that God is a good candidate for being the designer of the universe. And so perhaps if you find it suggestive or persuasive, you might think, well, perhaps God does exist. But it doesn't show that God must exist or necessarily exists. All right, let's turn now to Anselm's ontological argument. So Anselm aims to establish a deductive argument for the existence of God. So he wants to show that the existence of God is necessary. It's called an ontological argument because ontology is the metaphysical study of the nature of being. It's about the nature of kinds of things. So Anselm is going to try to show that given the nature of being of God, given how we conceive of God, given the kind of being God is, it would follow that God must necessarily exist. All right, so let's look at each of the individual premises. Premise 1, God is the greatest thing that can be conceived. Premise 1 of the ontological argument is based on the traditional conception of God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. So if God has these attributes, it's going to be hard to imagine anything greater than God, because these attributes make the being so exceptional. So this premise is specifically ontological because it's based on the nature of being. It's based on the nature of what we think God is like. We think God is all-powerful, we think God is all-knowing, and we think God is all-good. And those things are especially excellent. So it follows that God is the greatest thing that can be conceived. Premise 2, a thing can exist in the mind only, or it can exist also in reality. According to this premise, some ideas and concepts are just conceptual or cognitive. They're in our minds, but they don't correspond to anything in the world. They don't have a match. Unicorns, for instance, are ideas. They're mental concepts, but they don't have a match in the real world because there isn't a real entity that we call a unicorn. So a unicorn is just a mental concept. It doesn't have an additional existence in reality. But other ideas and concepts have both a cognitive aspect and a real existence. So we all, as citizens of the United States, have ideas about Barack Obama. We can produce a mental image of Barack Obama in our mind. But then also, we should note that Barack Obama has a real existence. He's a real person. So he exists in both our minds and also in reality. Anselm says that it's better to exist in reality than only in the mind. So here Anselm, in premise 3, is introducing a statement of value. He's saying things which have an existence in reality are better than those things which remain mere concepts or ideas. Here, I think, is the most challenging of the premises in Anselm's argument. It's premise 3 that many objections are going to target. The idea is something like this. Look, imagine the idea of your dream vacation, or your dream car, or your dream partner. Now imagine them in reality. Wouldn't it be better if they existed in reality and not merely in the mind? This shows that it's better to exist in reality than only in the mind. We're going to circle back to this premise. Premise 4, if God existed only in the mind, then God wouldn't be the greatest thing. So this premise is going to spell out the implications of premise 1 and 3 taken together. Premise 1 says that God is the greatest thing that can be conceived. That's Anselm's ontological idea of what God is. And premise 3 says that it's better to exist in reality than only in the mind. That's his statement of value. it seems to follow that for a thing to be the greatest thing that can be conceived, it can't exist just in the mind, because after all, things which exist only in the mind are not as good as things which exist in reality. So if God's really going to be the greatest thing, given the idea that it's better to exist in reality than in the mind, it follows that God can't exist only in the mind. And we should see now where Anselm's going with this argument. Conclusion. Therefore, God must exist in reality. So this conclusion is implied by premises 1 and 4, taken together. Since God is the greatest thing that can be conceived, since it's better to exist in reality than only in the mind, God must exist in reality. So Anselm believes he has shown that God necessarily exists, just based on the kind of being God is. All right, let's look at an objection to Anselm's ontological argument. We can scrutinize arguments two separate ways, by evaluating their structure and by considering the truth of the premises. So arguments might fail because their structure is bad, and arguments might fail because their premises are false. Kant is going to criticize Anselm's argument by objecting to premise 3. Premise 3 says it's better to exist in reality than only in the mind. All right. Kant has this specific phrase he uses to object to premise 3. He says, existence is not a predicate. So spend some time talking about what a predicate is and why Kant thinks existence is not one. When we predicate something of an object, we ascribe that thing to it as an attribute. So here's an example. Here's a sentence. The dog is cute. In that sentence, there's an object. The object is the dog. And there's a predicate. And the predicate is cute. Thus, the sentence ascribes the attribute cuteness to the dog. It predicates cuteness of the dog. But Kant thinks it doesn't make sense to ascribe to an object existence as an attribute. He doesn't think that it makes sense to predicate of any specific object existence. So here's a thought experiment. Suppose you're shopping for a vehicle on a used car website. And so you might be checking off boxes in order to select specific attributes that you desire in the car. So you might select for made in the US, 4-door, less than 100,000 miles on it. You might want something that's 4-wheel drive for the snowy winters. But Kant says, in addition to these attributes, it wouldn't make sense for you to click another box which says existence. So it wouldn't make sense to additionally include the attribute existence in your search for the car. Existence wouldn't add any value to your search. If it doesn't make sense to ascribe to an object existence as an attribute, then premise 3 of Anselm's argument will be false. It wouldn't make sense to say that it's better to exist in reality than only in the mind, because existence is not an attribute possessed by objects which can make them better or worse. And if premise 3 is false, then the conclusion does not follow, and Anselm's argument fails. Each of the premises of an argument need to be true for the conclusion to follow. If Kant has succeeded in showing that premise 3 is false, then the conclusion does not follow. All right, quick review. Anselm offers a deductive argument for the existence of God based on our conception of just what God is, or the nature of God, the nature of God's being. He argues that since God is the greatest thing that can be conceived, and since it's better to exist in reality than only in the mind, it would necessarily follow that God must exist. Kant objects to this argument by claiming that existence is not a predicate. Existence is not an attribute that makes something better or worse. And in so doing, he intends to show that Anselm's premise 3 is false. And if premise 3 is false, then the conclusion is also false, and the argument fails.